Hi, everyone. Welcome to Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller. I've spent over 30 years in healthcare sales, from building lasting partnerships to driving real results for hospitals and health systems. And I'm here to share what I've learned about leading with service and how that can change the game for you, no matter where you are in your career. So today I want to talk about something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and it's really about how executives actually make buying decisions, like what's really going on when a hospital CEO or CFO says yes to a vendor. And I think, there's this quiet myth out there right now that's circulating through B2B sales literature and leadership podcasts and boardrooms, and it goes something like this. In the modern enterprise, no executive can or should make a meaningful decision without consensus. The committee makes the decision now. The CEO is just one vote out of 11. The CFO defers to the working group. And it sounds right, but I think when you actually look at the evidence, it falls apart. Now, I'm not saying that consensus doesn't matter, right? It does. Committees in alignment are important, but I don't believe they're solely responsible for making decisions. In my experience, leaders are still the ones making the final call. And I think consensus has been badly mistranslated. Consensus is an agreement. It's shared awareness that a problem or an opportunity is worth solving and shared visibility into how the decision gets made. Not everyone has to agree. Everyone has to be in the know. And once you accept that distinction, I think, the data on how high-performing executives actually behave starts to make a lot more sense. So let me start with what I think is one of the biggest misconceptions in B2B sales, and that's this idea of the rational executive. For decades, we've built our sales and marketing strategies on this assumption that business purchases are entirely rational, right? The executive evaluates features, compares prices, calculates ROI, and selects the objectively best option. And the research consistently, and I'd say emphatically, proves otherwise. So there was a landmark study done by Google and CEB, which is now part of Gartner, and they surveyed 3,000 purchasers across 36 B2B brands in multiple industries. And the findings were, I think, really striking. B2B brands drive more emotional connections than B2C brands, not fewer. And that's counterintuitive, right? Because you think consumer brands, the ones we see on TV and social media, would be more emotional. But most B2C brands had emotional connections with about 10 to 40% of consumers, and 7 out of the 9 B2B brands they studied surpassed 50%. And, the reason makes total sense when you think about it. When a consumer makes a bad purchase, the stakes are relatively low, right? You bought the wrong, whatever, that's fine. But when an executive makes a bad business purchase, like a large-scale technology or services acquisition, the stakes are enormous. You're talking about professional reputation, business performance, and honestly, you could lose your job over it. So the business customer isn't going to commit unless there's a substantial emotional connection and a deep sense of trust to help overcome that professional risk. And here's the part that I think really changes how you should be thinking about selling. The same study found that B2B purchasers are almost 50% more likely to buy a product or service when they see personal value in it. And I'm not talking about the company's value, right? I'm talking about personal value, like an opportunity for career advancement or pride and confidence in their choices. Buyers who perceive high personal value are 71% more likely to buy, and they're 8 times more likely to pay a premium. And in contrast, only 14% of business decision makers are willing to pay a premium for business value alone, like unique product features or differentiation. So business value is table stakes, right? Personal value is the true differentiator. And that means executives aren't just asking, what does this do for my company? They're simultaneously and often unconsciously asking, what does this do for me? So I think the other really, really important piece of this is the work of Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, and his research on what's called prospect theory. And what Kahneman showed is that human beings are fundamentally risk-averse and will actually seek risk more often to avoid a loss than to get a gain. So in a B2B context, right, choosing a new vendor or implementing a new solution is inherently risky. And executives are, often really hesitant to change the status quo for a potential gain. But if you frame their current situation as a loss to be avoided, like a competitive threat, a growing inefficiency, a regulatory risk, they become far more willing to take that risky bet on a new solution. And this is why I think the most effective sales narratives don't lead with features and benefits, right? They lead with a vivid picture of the cost of inaction. And it also explains, the old adage, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Executives often default to established safe brands, not because they offer the best features, but because they offer the lowest perceived professional risk. And the fear of career damage is a more powerful motivator than the promise of a better outcome. So now that we understand the psychology, I want to walk you through what the actual buying journey looks like for executives today, because it's changed dramatically. And I think most sellers are still, operating with an outdated picture of how this works. So the first stage is what triggers the buying journey in the first place. And it almost never starts with the vendor's outreach, right? It starts with a problem, a strategic shift, or an external trigger. And, research from Sixth Sense shows that almost half of buyers say economic conditions shorten their buying cycles, and 62% say those pressures push them to engage sellers earlier. So you've got things like a competitive threat that reveals a capability gap, a regulatory change that forces technology upgrades, a new CEO or CFO who brings a completely different strategic agenda, or a failed internal initiative that creates urgency for an external solution. And that recognition of a problem, that's the true beginning of the buying journey, and it happens long before any vendor is contacted. So the second stage is what I'd call the invisible journey, right? And this is where executives and their teams do extensive independent research, often without any vendor even knowing about it. And the data on this phase is, I think, really eye-opening. 83% of buyers have mostly or fully defined their purchase requirements before they ever speak with sales. 94% are now using AI and large language models during their buying process. And only 9% of buyers consider vendor websites to be reliable sources of information, which, should make every marketing team stop and think for a second. And here's the one that I think really matters. 68% of B2B buyers already have a preferred vendor before they formally begin the purchase process. So the practical implication is really profound, right? By the time an executive engages with you, the shortlist is often already formed. Winning the deal frequently depends on being present and credible during the research phase, not just during the sales process. And then stage 3 is about, how executives build that shortlist, and it's through peer networks, right? Not vendor marketing. 73% of B2B marketing executives rank word of mouth and peer recommendations as the most influential factor in deciding which vendors to even consider. And 56% of buyers consult with existing product users before purchasing, and that number goes up to 71% for enterprise-level purchases. So for executives, the question isn't just, does this product work, right? It's, do people I respect and trust use this product? And I think the social proof of a respected peer's endorsement can be more persuasive than any analyst report or vendor demo you're ever going to put together. Stage 4 is the buying committee, and this is where it gets, really complicated and really political. Even when an executive has a strong personal preference, the final decision is rarely theirs alone, right? The typical B2B purchase now involves a team of about 10 people. 79% of purchases require CFO approval. 72% involve high-complexity buying groups that span IT, operations, finance, and end users. And another 72% of buying teams actually hire consultants or analysts to help with the decision. And the problem is, all of these people have different priorities, right? IT is worried about integration and security. Finance is focused on cost and ROI. The end users just want to know if it's easy to use. And when you've got all of those competing interests in one room, that's why 86% of B2B purchases stall somewhere during the process. But here's where I think, the whole thing gets really, really interesting, and it's stage 5, the final decision. Because the final decision is the most revealing moment in any buying journey, right? It's where the consensus myth most reliably collapses. And I want to tell you a story that was documented in Harvard Business Review because I think it just perfectly illustrates what actually happens. So Merck, the pharmaceutical giant, decided to outsource its data processing system. And they did everything right, The evaluation committee ran a clean process, compared vendors, and reached a clear consensus. The contract should go to Accenture. And then shortly before the signing, Merck's CEO received a personal visit from Sam Palmisano, who was the CEO of IBM at the time. And Palmisano didn't run a counter-evaluation, right? He didn't file a competing proposal. He leveraged the executive-to-executive relationship. He demonstrated a deep understanding of Merck's strategic challenges, and he personally committed IBM's resources to the project. and Merck's CEO overruled the committee and awarded the contract to IBM. Now I want you to really sit with that for a second, right? The evaluation team was in agreement. The contract was about to be signed. Then a different conversation happened at a different level, and the decision changed. This is not an anomaly, and it's not a rogue CEO ignoring his organization. It's a CEO using new strategic information brought to him by a peer to reach a different conclusion than the group. The committee did real work. The committee did not make the final call. The committee built awareness. The CEO decided. So I think that story really sets up the bigger question, which is, what does real consensus actually look like? And what has executive authority actually become? And the first thing I want to kind of retire is this idea that committee-based buying has erased executive authority. It hasn't. It's only made authority less visible. So Bain & Company has this framework called RAPID, and the point they make is really direct. Ideally, there should only be one decider for each decision, with primary accountability for the outcome. The committee informs, the recommender drives, somebody decides, and that somebody is accountable. And what's interesting is that authority gets even more, nuanced when you look at who can block versus who can approve, right? A legal team may not own product strategy, but they can effectively veto product choices. Finance may not own hiring strategy, but they can shape every plan through headcount control. And the CEO doesn't need to vote, right? The agenda only contains what she allowed onto it. So it looks like consensus is often, a ceremony performed around a decision that authority has already shaped. And here's the thing that I think cuts against a whole decade of management thinking. So there was a 2026 Harvard Business Review study that followed CEOs at private equity-backed companies that consistently delivered outsized returns. And the standout finding was that 53 of these super performer CEOs, who average over 6 times return on invested capital, which is more than double the typical industry target, they replaced consensus with autonomous team decision authority and real-time information systems. They didn't build broader buying committees, right? They built tighter accountability. They replaced approval chains with authorized teams. They replaced weekly status meetings with real-time signals. And instead of needing everybody to agree, they said, you own this, you make the call. And McKinsey found something similar, that the best CEOs don't let their teams get stuck in the talking phase. They encourage real debate, but then they move, right? It's debate, then execute. And I think that's, really well said. Because debate is valuable, input is valuable, but debate and input are not decisions, right? The leaders who convert one into the other produce results, and the leaders who keep deferring, they produce meetings. And I think the most uncomfortable part of all of this, is what consensus often actually masks. We tell ourselves that consensus produces better decisions, and sometimes it does, right? When stakes are shared, when information is widely held, when the cost of misalignment exceeds the cost of delay. But the most common failure mode is that decision makers must actually be decisive and bring the discussion to a close, even when there's conflicting views, and most don't. And I think, the diagnosis here is really plain. Too many decisions require consensus because no one wants to own the trade-off. And I think that sentence, should be on the wall of every executive suite because it names what consensus often actually is, a way of distributing the risk of being wrong so widely that no one carries it, a way of saying we decided when nobody decided. When a CEO insists on full agreement before moving on a vendor or a program or a strategic pivot, she's sometimes practicing inclusion, right? But she's just as often practicing self-protection. And buying committees that have grown to 11, 12, 15 people, they're rarely larger because the decision has gotten more complex. They're larger because the willingness to own the call has gotten smaller. So I think at this point, it's worth understanding what's actually happening in the brain when an executive makes a buying decision, because the neuroscience really reinforces everything we've been talking about. And the decision-making process isn't a single event, right? It's actually a 2-stage process. The first stage happens in the amygdala, which is the emotional and intuitive part of your brain. This is where the gut feeling, the sense of trust or distrust, and the emotional response to a vendor's narrative all originate. And the decision to change, to take the risk of a new vendor, that decision is made here. And the second stage happens in the prefrontal cortex, the rational, logical part of the brain where language and analysis live. And this part is used primarily to explain and justify the decision that's already been made emotionally. And this is why executives ask for ROI calculations and TCO models and reference checks, right? They're not using those tools to make the decision. They're using them to validate a decision they've already made and to provide cover if the decision is later questioned. And the practical implication of that, I think, is really, really critical. If you haven't won the emotional argument, no amount of ROI data is going to close the deal. But if you have won the emotional argument, the ROI data just needs to be good enough to provide justification. So given everything we've talked about, I think the question for sellers becomes, how do you influence executive thinking when so much of the decision happens before you're even in the room? And this is where thought leadership plays a really, really outsized role. So the 2024 Edelman LinkedIn B2B Thought Leadership Impact Report surveyed almost 3,500 management-level professionals across 7 countries, and they found that effective thought leadership makes buyers re-examine their assumptions about their own challenges, actually creating demand where none previously existed. It can inoculate companies against competitors trying to poach their customers by reinforcing the customer's confidence in their existing vendor's strategic vision. And I think most importantly, it's particularly effective at engaging the 95% of business clients who aren't actively seeking goods or services at any given moment, right? That's the out-of-market majority. And that means the executive buying decision is often shaped months or even years before the formal evaluation process begins through the steady accumulation of credibility and insight delivered through your thought leadership. So let me kind of bring all of this together because I think, there are some really clear takeaways here. Real consensus isn't unanimous comfort. It's the discipline of bringing every relevant stakeholder along on the why. The reason this problem is worth solving, the opportunity at stake, the information considered, the path forward. So everybody's informed, everybody understands the why, but that doesn't mean everybody has to agree. For executives, the bar isn't full agreement, right? It's clarity on the trade-off, conviction in the direction, transparency with the team about how the call was reached, and willingness to be accountable for the outcome. Input from the team is essential. Their permission is not. And for those of us selling into the C-suite, the work is not to assemble a coalition large enough to remove all internal friction. The work is to give the executive who already has authority, the clarity, the evidence, and the strategic insight to use it well and to help bring the team along on the why. The organizations that consistently win executive buyers, they understand this duality, right? They build emotional connections through thought leadership and authentic relationships. They reframe the cost of inaction rather than simply promoting the benefits of action. They invest in peer networks and customer communities that provide social proof, and they make sure their own executives engage with buyers as genuine growth champions who bring strategic insight and a long-term perspective to every interaction. And in the modern B2B landscape, the brands that win aren't the loudest or the most feature-rich, they're the most trusted. So if your sales team is still trying to win deals by building the biggest possible coalition, I think you're leaving the most important conversation off the table. And, if this resonates with you, if you're thinking about how to redesign your executive engagement strategy so the right C-suite relationships get built early and the right insights land at the right moment, I talk about this a lot in my newsletter and in my work with revenue leaders. There's a link in the show notes. That's it for today's episode of Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller, and I'll be back next week with more strategies to help you sell smarter and stand out.